as I was introduced, my name is Scott Scaggs. I have been with Clean Design for about 5 years. I'm the Chief Creative Officer there. And prior to that, I spent another 20 years working for ad agencies of one sort or another. I kind of came up as an art director, but I always considered myself an art director / designer. You guys kind of know the difference between art director and designer? Does that mean anything? Yeah, okay. Because it's a weird subject. It depends on who you talk to as to what answer you're going to get. So I used to believe that the difference was that art directors actually had to read the copy, and that was what set them apart. But I have now, having worked with such amazing and talented designers, I have really come back around on that. And now I understand that I think designers just have a more open way of thinking about design and aren't really thinking about ads specifically. So I think that world continues to evolve. And but all of that aside, let me just hear quickly from you guys what you want to be doing, what your career path looks like for you guys. I just want to be able to tailor my remarks to something that's relevant to you. If anybody wants to speak up with, yes, thank you.
I'll be somewhere in like management or leadership position.
Okay. Okay. Great.
I'm bossy.
I'd love to do product design, but
Yeah.
honestly, I'll really take anything that will pay well. Just start out.
In it for the money then, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, I'm in it for the money, but I'd like to get into film. Do
Great.
graphic design for
Sure.
movies, productions.
Yeah, motion graphics, that kind of thing.
Not so much that, like what you see on the film and on the movie, on the screen,
Mm-hmm.
like printed materials,
Oh,
signage,
okay.
you know,
Okay.
how the things look.
Okay, right, yeah. So that, on a film set, that's an art director job typically, right? Okay.
But they have graphic designers that produce
Mm-hmm.
props.
Right.
They actually design the props.
Yeah. Very cool.
Printed stuff, materials.
Like that.
I've kind of tried my hand at freelancing for now, see where that takes me.
Okay.
And then I'd like to get a job at an ad or design agency. Start as a designer, maybe move towards art director. I think I'm a bit more of an idea guy. Some people are probably better at designing than I am. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
See how it goes.
All right. So just to give you I don't know, a different perspective on that, I don't have anybody on my staff who is titled art director. They're all designers of different levels, but they're all responsible for ideas. Everybody has to be conceptual in the creative department and beyond, really. But you know, I didn't mean to set up too much of a difference between art director and designer initially, but
Well, there is one. I mean, you
yeah.
have a different title.
yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. So yeah.
I mean, pretty much every art director is going to start off as a designer, aren't you?
Not necessarily.
Yeah?
Not necessarily. I think that there are those who are more production-oriented, whether that is a mechanical artist, a studio artist, or an animator, or depends on what field exactly you're going into. So there are those who are technically proficient, and those skills are certainly looked for. And then there are those who are more conceptual, and again, their technical abilities are less in play, but the conceptual abilities are certainly the areas of interest to certain employers. Both perfectly viable tracks, but you have some that are, thinkers and idea people, and you have some that are production and really more technically oriented and can figure out how to take an idea and make it come to life. And then there's a lot of people who kind of work in the middle of that. So I would make that distinction versus art director designer. I would say more production versus conceptual. All right, so what is the name of this class, first of all, so that I can also make sure that I get that?
Client media relations.
It's what, client? Client media relations, good. Okay. All right, so I have a fairly short presentation for you guys today, but what I wanted to do was take you through a little bit of what Clean Design does on identity work, just to give you a quick overview of what that's all about. And then I have one that I'll dive a little deeper into as a case study. We recently did the identity for the town of Fuquay-Varina. Does anybody live there by any chance? Not a soul. Wow. So population 0, but we will, I'll at least kind of talk you through the process of what that was like working with the client, both in the strategy phase, on through development, and then really trying to get something finalized, which is not always as easy as maybe it should be, or you would hope it was. So with that said, let me jump to the next slide. This is really just an overview of the services that Clean Design offers. We really kind of categorize it into these buckets, which kind of spill over into each other quite a bit. But we do identity, graphic design, public relations, digital of all shapes and sizes, advertising, and media buying and placement as well. So really the whole point of this is that we're a full service agency. We started out as a design firm. And in fact, our very first client was John Deere, and we did flyers and circulars and catalogs and that kind of work. And we have since, in the past 20 years, because this is actually our 20th year in business, evolved into something much broader than that as far as our service offering. So first, really the only box I wanted to talk about today was identity, because that's what the examples that I have are most relevant to. So moving on to the next slide. Identity, there you go. I was right about what comes next. Let's go on to the next slide. I really just gathered a few examples of some of the identity projects that the agency has worked on. A couple of them of note. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's the logo, and it's actually a part of a bigger identity system for the transit systems in the Triangle area, with Go Triangle as being the link between them all, but this included Raleigh, Durham, Cary, Chapel Hill, and at one point the NC State bus line was considering being a part of it, but they pulled out early in the process. But we ended up with a renaming and rebranding assignment, which also ended up in new bus designs that are out on the road finally now, 2 years in the making. But we do a good amount of pro bono work and nonprofit work. This Not a Moment to Lose thing that we see here in the bottom is something that we have done recently for the V Foundation, which is all about funding cancer research, and it's not a specific kind of cancer research that they're funding. They are actually the ones who are coordinating efforts of different areas of study and helping one to advance the other more quickly. So it's actually, they're doing some great things and have a lot of momentum, and so this Not a Moment to Lose was a fundraising campaign that we developed for them. And a number of other things. There's a lot of tourism business that we handle. You see the Boone, North Carolina logo that we did here. And we also go from the mountains to the beaches and do the Wilmington area, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, Curie Beach, and also in the middle of the state, here in this area, we do the town of, actually it's Orange County, so the town of Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and Hillsborough are also tourism clients of ours. So those are always fun things to do. Enough about this. Let's move on to the next slide. More fun to have. So identity is not always just a logo. In fact, it should never just be a logo, and I can get to that point more in a minute. But we have been working with Lone Rider Beer for a few years, and when they came to us, they were ready to move from they were actually the number 2 craft beer distributor or maker in the state, which is already pretty impressive. Because the state of North Carolina is pretty big in the craft brew scene. But the packages were all very disparate design-wise, and they were just invisible on the shelf, and they wanted to get that right before really expanding operations. increasing production and moving into other states, trying to get through some of the, I guess, legal constraints to do that. So we were with them all through that and redesigned the characters that were a part of these labels so that they all retained the essence of what was true initially, but found a consistent style that made it work. And so they had been doing this Old West sort of thing style-wise with almost this parchment look behind it, and the characters were just kind of line art on top of that. But the craft beer market, and if you look at any store, whether it's convenience store, whether it's grocery store, or any place that you're going to find a variety of craft beer, some of that packaging is amazing, and it is really eye-catching. I hate to use that term, but stuff that really commands attention. And we needed to take them from these bland, pen and ink sort of parchment-looking backgrounds and do something that really would bring some more attention to it. The other thing is this whole Old West theme didn't really play with the craft beer audience. I mean, those who used to watch a lot of Westerns have really aged out of the market, and we needed to appeal to a younger group. By younger, I certainly mean above 21 for any, just for the record. But the style that we worked with the client to define, and we did this by finding literally hundreds of illustration styles, pinning them up all over a conference room wall, and starting to make groups out of these styles and figure out which style starts to make sense. This was a way of exploring a mood board, and again, I have another example of that in a few minutes. But by doing this, we were able to zero in on this area that made a lot of sense, which was sort of a graphic novel inspired, colorful, but still edgy look. And that's where we ended up for Lone Rider Beer and developed an entire campaign and line extension products and point of sale materials and advertising and all that kind of stuff that came after this. So, but we don't just do beer packaging. Next slide. Yeah, we also do gin and hard liquor. Oh my gosh, we seem like such lushes now. These are just some of the fun things to look at, so that's why I brought them. This is a fairly new addition to our client list. It's Durham Distillery, and they just started brewing last fall, or distilling last fall, and they've already been named North Carolina Distiller of the Year by some prominent source whose name I don't recall at the moment. But what was really cool about this project was that we had a chance to name it and design the packaging, and then move on from there and do all of the point of sale materials and advertising and all of that good stuff. Actually, PR, we do a lot of PR for.
You named it?
Yes, we did. Yeah, so one of the fun things about Conniption is that hidden in the, okay, and that's on the, yeah, well, I'll tell you what's back there. Actually, that's on the back side of the bottle. There's a metallic ink that is on the back of it, and so the name Conniption and American Dry and Navy Strength, those things are on the front. But this idea of having a conniption fit was, because it's fun to say have a conniption, right? That's what's represented in this actually delicate line work, artwork that's on the back. Is you've got all sorts of words, and they also wanted a very southern flavor to it. So imagine some, I don't know, middle-aged proper southern woman having a conniption fit and the things that she might say. So you have all sorts of goodness gracious, for crying out loud, and all those little words and all those little phrases, including some that are expletives, which are represented by some of the hashtag @ symbols and things like that. When cartoons curse, that's what comes out, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I just was giving you a little bit of a glimpse into what is hidden in that artwork in the background. So this has been fun, yeah.
Yeah, very cool designs. The photos that you showed for both the beer and the gin now, did you use Photoshop mock-ups for those, or are those professionally shot?
Very good question. It's a combination of real photography and a little bit of Photoshop work. The bottles, I believe we had production versions of those ready to go. For Conniption, we actually had to have some photos of that done before any production versions of these were ready. What we had were some prototypes, basically some proofs of the bottle, but the final design changed a little bit from when that prototype was made. So we ended up taking a plain glass bottle, taking the print with the copper ink in the background, and mocking that up, but it is their actual bottle design. But again, it was cobbled together not to be in the least bit deceitful, but just to make up for the fact that we didn't have the real bottle yet.
It would be hard to shoot glass and still show the intricacy of the artwork.
That's true. This was tough. I actually shot these. I have a little cube made out of a white translucent material, and in shooting glass, you're exactly right. It's going to reflect everything around it. So you want to put it in the most controlled environment possible to do that. But a little post work, a little Photoshop work on the back end of that certainly helps to clean it up and make it pristine.
Is there liquid in those bottles?
There is. I'm trying to remember if we actually had gin bottles or if that's water. Funny, they photograph the same though.
Where are they located
They are they're in Durham. You know where the old baseball park is, the one where they shot Bull Durham? It's
okay.
pretty much right there in that
at?
area.
Right there next to Blue Note.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, same little strip. So anyway, let's keep moving.
I think you had a question.
Oh, sorry about that.
So the designs, the line art and the designs, are those typically done by one person, or do you have multiple people that work on that piece?
No, good question. When our agency was a little bit smaller, I used to get every designer on staff to jump in and develop, whether it's logo designs, identity designs, or package designs. As we've grown, I have narrowed that down to about 3 designers that I want to do that. Typically, there is one designer assigned to a job, but identity projects, logo projects, packaging, things like this, or any really big campaign opportunity, I like getting the additional perspectives that you get by bringing multiple designers in. So on this one, I probably had either 4 or 5 designers working on this. This was when it began. But the designer whose work was chosen and who continues to be the lead creative on this piece of business has only been, she came to me after 1 year working somewhere else, and she was right out of school, 1 year of experience. So at the time that she did this, she was probably only 3 years into the business. And she just does some amazing work. Okay. Anything else, we'll move on. Talking about package design, there's kind of a weird question with this because, as I had mentioned earlier, that with the Go Triangle, Go Raleigh, Go Durham, which are the buses that you see here, I just had recently entered this in the Addy Awards, which is kind of an industry. You guys heard of that? Heard of the Addy Awards? Okay. So the category for this was really hard to figure out because there's a category for bus and transit, but that's really talking about advertising on bus and transit, whether it's posters or full wraps and things like that. I kind of considered this package design. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that created some head scratching with some of the people who were helping to coordinate that show. So anyway, we went back and forth on that. I will tell you it's still a big thrill to see work that the agency did out on the road, like, stopped behind a bus that has your work on it. It's kind of cool. And going to the craft beer aisle and picking up a package that you guys had, something that we had worked on is still very cool. The designer whose design ended up moving forward on these, our Boone client is talking about doing some transit ads in the Triangle, and I kept telling her that if there is a Boone ad on your bus on your bus that you design. So the world's got to implode or something. That's got to be like such overload of layering of your work out in the world, which I think is pretty cool. So you guys have seen these buses around? Okay.
I have one question about the Boone logo, if we,
Yeah.
if we don't mind rewinding a little bit.
All right, let's back up.
Circular. Can we go back a couple slides?
To the logo page.
Well, this
There we go.
one-
That's it.
That one?
Yes.
Okay, so the mountain graphic, the vector seems to have like a little pinch on either side of the mountain, and then the far right edge of that path descends lower than the far left edge. Why were those decisions made?
It is.
I don't mean to.
No. I would say that it's really merely following the contours of the typography. One decision that was made pretty, I guess deliberately, was this line initially came out to here, and there was concern that people would look at that as, and I think the client first brought this up, that there was some, I don't know if it was a campaign or if it was just something that sort of caught on, that Boone was referred to as the Boo. And the thought, I had never heard that.
Oh.
And so the thought was that it was trying to be a long O, trying to revive that. And so it just goes to show you that there are always like layers of things that you would never expect to be a part of the conversation. But we had to back that up so that it doesn't look like a long O. But that's really, that got more discussion than, where these lines ended up. The other thing that's really looking for the way it balances, I would say, is as much of that decision as anything. So, you've got a little bit of something to offset with this, which I think is why this nice long line over here.
Sense of elevation too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really good point too. All right.
Thanks, sorry.
Yeah, no. I'm glad to answer what I can, and then I'll make up the rest. All right. So buses. Next thing I think is our case study. All right. So a couple of points that I wanted to make. Actually, three points that I wanted to make sure that we got across in what I was going to share with you today. One is that, I think I already mentioned this, that identity isn't just a logo. And we have embraced this thought because every time we present logos, we don't just present a logo on a board. We try to, and you'll see this in the example in a few minutes, try to include other branded elements that are a part of the overall identity system. When a logo is examined in isolation, the client might have a hard time, or almost always has a hard time, thinking about the practical application of that logo, or what the other elements might be that are a part of the identity system. Is there, what's the more complete color palette? Are there patterns, or is there photographic style that really helps to represent what we want to communicate visually for this brand? So we want to think of that broader context. The logo is a part of that. The other thing to consider, and this relates very much to the second point here, that buy-in starts early. One of the most difficult things that we as an agency have to sell would be logos. So this identity thing is highly subjective. It is highly personal, especially if you're talking to a company founder or a CEO, somebody who feels very vested in the brand that you're talking about rebranding or changing. And then there's a broader community of people who, for one reason or another, have an attachment to the way things are. Every few months, there seems to be a story that surfaces about somebody who changed their logo and the public outcry that made them change it back. And I really feel for the team that had tried to put that new thing in place, because more often than not, you look at it and there's really nothing wrong with it, the new version. But the buy-in that you get, not just from your client, but any stakeholders, and stakeholders could be, the community at large. I think that there was a University of California, and I'm not sure which, maybe it was the whole university system in California, probably about 2 or 3 years ago, they developed a new logo for University of California, and it was very, very modern, and it was kind of a cool mark. Nothing wrong with it, again, but the outcry was just unbelievably passionate. And people didn't want it changed. They thought it was ridiculous. They trashed the new logo up and down. And it's a big part of the problem is they didn't sell it through right. They did not get everybody aligned around an idea that could then be expressed by that logo. So you had a lot of people saying, well, this isn't my school. I went there, and now it's something different. So you have to understand the emotions of people, of any of those stakeholders, before just thrusting the change upon them. So in this area, this buy-in, it's not just the person who is commissioning you to do a logo, but I just want you to understand that the reach is much greater than that. And then the third point here is that better strategic input leads to better creative output. When I first started at Clean Design, our input sessions were talking across a conference room table for the most part. And I remember thinking that we weren't getting what we needed, really. It was just kind of a meeting where they talked a little bit about what they might want, and I realized that there was room for improvement. So I worked with our strategist at the time, who had actually just moved from being an intern at the agency to full-time employee. Our lead strategist had just left to pursue another job where he had family elsewhere. And this guy who was, months ago an intern and is now a strategist and bearing all the responsibility for this, really stepped up and embraced this idea. And we worked together and developed this system of workshops that we could use to get client input. And they're more like games, card games in a lot of instances. And what became really fascinating about that is a lot of good things started to happen. One is the input got better. The input became something that the creatives could use, and the clients felt like they were a part of it. So that's almost the most important piece of this, is we now have this series of exercises to take them through where we're able to get the information that we need. Then we make sure that they invite everybody who gets a vote, about the final logo, the final identity system. If they get a vote, they need to be in these workshops. And they have ended up being some of the most fun things that the clients do. They invariably end up leaving after one of these sessions and telling us later that we all ended up talking the entire way back in the car, kind of arguing if it's this or if it's that, or if it's, this is our archetype or that's our archetype. So it's really interesting that if you get the client engaged in the right way and you make it interesting for them, unlike I am, because I just saw you yawn. I'm so sorry to call you out on that. I'll step it up. I'm sorry. That really great things can happen. So if you walk away with nothing else, I think that these 3 points are definitely worth speaking about.
One, it's that time of day. So.
Oh, okay.
It's been a long day for all of
But
us.
without getting your trade secret,
Yeah.
Can you give some kind of example of how you engage and make it fun?
Next slide, please. All right, so yes, absolutely. And I want to walk you through some of the things that we do. Are they trade secrets? Well, no, because there are other agencies that have done similar things. I think that what we do differently, and I actually share this with people who work at other agencies, because I think we all should be doing this, is involving the client. I strongly believe that I would be doing the agency a disservice if I tried to look like the creative genius who came in and turned over a presentation board and the client said, that's amazing, how do you do it? I think that's ridiculous. You should be at a point where they have been invested in the process and so brought along by all the exercises that have been done and all the conversation that's been done that when you're showing them creative for the first time, they should go, yes, that's exactly what we've been talking about. There's no big ta-da, there's no big, oh, well, aren't we clever moment. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into this. The first slide up here, there we go, is where they used to be. Fuquay Varina used to have this thing that looked like a 1983 public access station. I don't know, that's the way I've always described it. And they had this thing everywhere. And then they started using this other one that you see on the right. They started using that one in a few places. And so both of them started showing up. Both of them looking, yeah, it totally does. Yeah, it's, neither one really felt up to date, and neither really captured the essence of what it is that they were trying to get across. So what were they trying to get across? Let's move to the next slide. All right, the first thing that we did was realized that this buy-in thing needs to include the people of the town. They were going to have a lot to say about it afterwards. Let's make sure that we give them a lot to say ahead of time so that they feel a part of this process. So this was just an ad that we put in the paper and basically solicited their help to take a survey and let us know your thoughts, your opinions. And we actually learned a lot from this. We got a tremendous amount of participation from the survey. I don't remember exactly what the percentage was, but when we compared it to typical response rates, it was exceptionally high. So this was great. We were already getting good information from a statistically significant group of people. And so moving on, one of the exercises that we first did with the client, and again, we get all of the stakeholder clients in the room, which was the town manager and the communications director, and actually I think the mayor was a part of it in some instances, and some other folks that were a part of this group that we worked with consistently as a client. So this card game is called our archetype workshop. And everybody kind of know what archetypes are. Archetypes, you know, when you're telling a story, or you know, there's the hero and there's the villain, there's the damsel in distress, there's the this, there's the that. So we didn't invent the idea of using archetypes in branding. There was a book called, what was it, The Hero and the Outlaw, or something like that. That's about 13, 14 years old at this point. And really, for the most part, this is something that account strategists or brand planners or whatever title they had would basically assign one. Just say, yep, nope, this brand needs to be the Maverick, and it needs to break all the rules, and it needs to blah, blah, blah. We decided to make this an exercise that the clients participate in. And what we would do is go through each of these. We would give a little bit of a description. We'd include a couple of brands that help them understand, okay, all right, now I get what you're saying. You're saying that you know, Virgin Airlines or Virgin Atlantic is a maverick company. Yes, very much so, because it's really the personification of Richard Branson, so that makes a lot of sense. So with each of those, there's an example of what makes that archetype work for a brand. And we'll go through and they'll say, yes, that's us, no, that's not us, and yeah, that's us today, but we really want to be this other thing. And so we get this really good conversation going on, especially whenever there are team members who have never really talked about what their brand could be. You get them starting to talk about what they envision and what the direction they'd like to see it go in, and what happens is they argue it out while they're looking at cards rather than while they're looking at logos. Much better for designers and for anybody trying to get creative in front of them. So we don't end up usually with one archetype, but we do force them to narrow it down to three, with one that's in the lead. And what's nice about this is they start bargaining with each other, and you have them, those that are starting to really defend one archetype versus another, and it's like, no, we're in business to do this. These are conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. And that's why this becomes, you know, this silly little set of archetype cards becomes the best conversation starter to really talk about what this brand represents for its target audience. So that's one thing. moving to the next slide, here's another deck of cards. And this is an exercise that doesn't really have an official name, but we call it this or that more often than not. And it's a set of cards that have two words, one on one side and one on the other. And those words might be sophisticated and rustic, and they have to choose one or the other. They're not always opposites. We have warm and we have cool, we have modern, we have classic, we have edgy, and we have polite. Or, so you can get a sense for, there's not an easy answer, to be honest. And when a client starts this game, they're like, this will be easy. And they'll get to a few of them, they'll just be completely stumped.
Would you rather?
Yeah, it is kind of like, would you rather, exactly. So what's nice about this is that it starts to give us a set of words that we can establish a brand voice with, and we can also establish the way the brand looks. Because there are also words like, is it dark and rich, or is it light and airy? So there's these design-oriented words that you can introduce into the conversation that really help to direct the creative as well. So once we've got this information, and maybe there's a survey out there, maybe there are stakeholder interviews that went on as well, we're starting to learn a lot. And so on the next slide, you'll see what we do with that to get to the final step before the brief is done. Now, these are 3 design boards. It's that each set of blocks there represents a different board. What we do with this is we take all of those words, the archetypes, some of the discussion that we've had about, well, our old logo is this, and whatever we do, we don't want it to be that. So some of those kind of comments are taken into consideration. And we start looking at it going, all right, well, we can slice this a few different ways, because the client says modern, but do they mean modern, like MoMA modern, or do they mean modern like, yeah, just kind of an up-to-date version of what we've got? So there's a lot of room for misinterpretation unless you start looking at some pictures and seeing, all right, you say you want to be different, how far out of different, or where you are do you want to be? What does different really mean? And this is our first way of starting to solve that. So not to go through that, but the discussion that we end up having with design boards, we start looking at specific design styles, photographic styles, color palettes, and we leave the words on there because sometimes it's a little too abstract for clients to react to without seeing some of the words associated with, hey, you know what, we're talking about a recipe with all the same ingredients, but we're going to dial up this ingredient versus that one and really see how the flavor changes as a result of that. So that's what comes out of the design boards.
While looking at the archetypes and the little theme mood boards,
Mhm.
I was wondering if those techniques are kind of a way not only to engage the client, but to actually have the client take a little bit of the process away from your design team so that you don't have to pull this information out of their brains. In fact, they can just tell you what they're looking for.
That is exactly right.
I had a freelance client, doesn't have a lot of time, I said, just draw me a sketch really quick.
Yeah.
And so that, he did that, it was really crummy, stick figure
Mhm.
type deal. But that took the project from like 0 to 60 because I was able to just do my own work from there.
That's really smart.
So-
Yeah, it's a great way to do it.
So you're engaging the client, making them feel special, but also
Mhm.
you're taking out a lot of your human resources and hours, and letting them lead the
Yeah.
way in the beginning.
Yeah, you both benefit. Both sides really benefit from this.
I was just thinking about if there might be any point to where you're like asking too much of the client and like pulling too much information. Do you ever get pushback and say, isn't that why we're hiring you guys? Like you're having to play all these games, you're taking up our time, like this is why we're paying you.
No, it's a good question. To be honest, if a client said that to us, we wouldn't work with them. We would say that this is an important process. We don't want to waste your time. Please don't waste ours. It's important if anybody's going to have a final say and whether this goes forward or not, that they be a part of this. But yes, there are plenty of clients who are like, just do something. And they're also the ones who are going to come back and say, that's not it. I'll know it when I see it. And everybody ends up getting frustrated. So So perfectly valid point, plenty of clients that would behave that way. We just don't want to work with them. How am I doing on time? I'm afraid that I am.
No, you're fine.
Okay, all right, good. All right, let me start taking you through the creative that we showed. Well, before I do that, this is actually what our, or back up two more. There we go. Oh, back up. Oh, it's all over. The show's done. Sorry. All right, move up one. There we go. All right. So this is. Do you guys work from briefs, communication briefs?
I was going to ask a quick question before we proceed.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this, what you're doing with the game, is replacing the creative brief?
Not at all. It is actually informing this brief. So every section of our creative brief, by the way, almost every agent, well, actually every other agency that I've ever worked for, this is a brief is a Word document, and it's usually not even, it's a creative brief, and it's neither creative nor a brief, because it's usually like 5 pages of a bunch of background information, and it's just a bunch of words, and it's not, there's nothing visual about it, which is kind of a shame, because we're trying to work towards something visual. Yes?
Could I take a picture of this?
Sure.
That later?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to point out some of the sections here, the way at the top we talk about, all right, what are we doing? What's our assignment? So logo and tagline concepts, really straightforward. That paragraph there, which is a little longer than most of them, really just try to sum up, hey, you know what, this brand does something that other brands don't. It really is here to help people do X, Y, Z. This little block right here, you know, if somebody read nothing but that on this brief, they would at least get the essence of it. In this case, for Fuquay Arena, it says, we're not selling a family-friendly town, we're selling a distinct blend. And we can talk, just based on everything that we had gotten to at this point, that's how we got to that point. Some of the support for it is that Fuquay Arena is made up of a combination of 2 historical towns with rich heritage, fosters individuality, which creates a blend of culture and people. So they really wanted to hang on to this idea that this is not in fact it's down here, we don't want to be cookie cutter like Cary. Sorry if anybody lives in Cary, but the last thing they wanted to do is be a bunch of strip centers and chain restaurants and all of that. They wanted to have a little bit of a unique small town flavor. Yeah, exactly. So that said, you know, we also look at how the brand connects with the audience. So in that section, we talk about, we actually had broke it down from awareness to consideration to research to visiting. So somebody who is maybe moving to the area, what they might be doing and what media they might come in contact with, or what opportunities for messaging we might be able to get in front of them. Who are we competing with? These are the other, I guess, townships and municipalities in the Triangle area, and we had noticed that there is very little current design in that set. I think Nightdale was a bit of an exception to that. They had just redesigned their identity. And this is actually my favorite part of the brief down here. It says, why might this project fail? Which seems like a weird and negative area to be in, but it really helps us to talk about the things to stay away from. And in this instance, we said, you know, if the logo evoked agriculture or plants, well, these are tobacco towns. So if you were trying to talk about this heritage and historical towns, why wouldn't you do that? You know, that's absolutely something they wanted to stay away from. So knowing that really saved the designers some failed efforts at tobacco leaf logos. If it felt like it was trying to be everything to everybody, so that was another point that we were able to make to them early on, is that, you know, it needs to appeal to the right audience in the right way. Otherwise it becomes generic, noisy, or it just fails exactly, diluted completely. So, and then there are some photographs that represent different aspects from the design boards that got a lot of talk. But you can see there's a lot of information on here, and there's the archetypes are mentioned in the small type, some of the words that came out of that, laid back, welcoming, unpretentious, also eclectic, quaint, and quirky came out of that. So we're starting to get a pretty good picture of where things should go, informed by the exercises, by the surveys, by really the conversation that we're still having with them all along the way. And we're starting to get a really good idea of where that creative needs to be directed versus this shotgun approach of, hey, let's just do a bunch of logos and see what they like. So that would waste everybody's time as well. So let's move on to the creative. So this was our first look at creative with the client, and we actually showed, I believe, 8 designs. I brought 3 with me, but let's go ahead and look at the first. You remember the quaint and quirky and eclectic and all of that? All right, here was one of the logos that we showed, and like I mentioned before, we didn't want it to just be a logo that is all isolated. We wanted to start showing, all right, there's a palette of color and pattern and texture and usefulness really that comes out of this. So we looked at, oddly enough, one of the most important things to them is, how are we going to embroider our shirts? Because I guess all of the city workers have these kinds of things, and they're very concerned with how that looks. So the color palette, and you can see some of the patterns that come out of that, were brought out. There's Aviator Brewery is based there, so we had some signage represented, like those banners through downtown that represented different areas of interest in the town. And what was really nice about this design was it did kind of get this eclectic, quirky feel, but it was also this idea of things that are coming together. And this, remember from the brand or the communication brief, it was talking about this idea of blending and being more than, multiple things coming together. So anyway, this was idea 1. Yes?
How often do you make your own type?
I would say as often as possible. Other than that, we just use Gotham. Fairly often. But I think that a lot of times, just because of a time crunch, it's the reality of trying to get a lot of work done, a lot of times you will end up just finding the right font.
Right.
And there are some good ones, and then there are a whole lot of bad ones out there. Some of that is subjective, some of it is just the fact that so many fonts are generated now, just because the software is in the hands of so many, that there's just not the same artful precision to type design, and some of it's just a mess. And just being able to, as a designer, distinguish between what's good and what's not good, and what's kind of a novelty and might have an application versus what would work in a more corporate situation or something that you actually want to give some longevity. We could talk a long time about type, but I love the craftsmanship of creating something that is custom and ownable. Okay, so there's the first design. It's and backing up one more, we started to associate taglines with each of this. So open to something new was the tagline that we had associated with this, which felt very colorful and fun, and that line really matched up with that, with the visual in that instance.
So you had a different tagline for each?
Yes, we don't always pair them, but in this instance it made sense. There was such a nice connection between some of the lines and some of the designs. So on the next one, the next design, Where Old and New Are Neighbors, and it was really trying to marry this whole heritage idea to something that is new and vibrant and up and coming, and a good place for an entrepreneurial spirit or a new family, that kind of stuff. But yet with a little more straightforward kind of design, not quite as funky and eclectic as the other. And so the mark in this instance was this coming together of downtowns. I think that there was some very loose interpretation of the street grid that went into that mark, and the different shades of red were again representing the parts that were coming together and blending. Moving on to the next one. This is at least where the winning design started. Was this. Now the tagline here is a dash more. And what was interesting about Fuquay Arena, and I guess still is that it is one of less than 5 hyphenated city names in the country. 2 of them are in North Carolina, Winston-Salem and Fuquay-Varina. So we thought, all right, that's something kind of interesting. You know, we're talking about this blend, right? So that hyphen kind of became a thing for us. And you can call it a hyphen or you can call it a dash. But a dash more started to make a lot of sense because it allowed us, it gave us a platform to talk about a dash more, you know, of whatever it is that you want to talk about, of open space or of parking tickets. I don't know, whatever. Maybe not that. So the other thing that was kind of cool is that the type, once again a custom font, was created using these dashes. In fact, there are, I think, 13 dashes that were used in the making of that font. And these dashes were also aligned in this basket weave kind of pattern, which you see represented in a couple of different ways down in the bottom there. And the cool thing about that was you could take that dash and you could turn it into something that represented that blend, that coming together, that fabric of community, however you want to describe it, started to really work. So moving to the next step, the client's like, yeah, we love that, we buy it. But can we see some other marks? Because we kind of want to mark with this, you know, because we want something that works in social media. And, well, and then whenever we have the shirts embroidered, because we're going to have something up there. So anyway, the conversation goes on. They get a little fearful of saying that the type itself is the logo. They want something that feels like a mark that goes with it. So we started exploring that. And actually, there were many, many more than what you see here. But our first recommendation actually was to go with that almost basket weave kind of use of the dash. But for whatever subjective reason, somebody on the committee just wasn't into it. So we kept working. We kept thinking about it, ways of using that same sort of dash to create, you know, use the negative space. This idea is fine, but to be honest, Fuquay-Varina doesn't have much of a skyline. And then looking at some different marks that got this idea across, the forward movement, the coming together of shapes, the isolating of the dash and all of that. But turning the page, we ended up with this mark, which started to do something kind of cool. Gave them not only what they could use in social media, something that it was, you know, isolated and worked in that really simple graphic way, but it is 2 things coming together. And you actually get this, I mean, the negative space between them starts to work. You start to get a sense of movement and a sense of, there are a lot of the right descriptors, especially as you look back on some of the descriptors that came out of those earlier exercises, that start to work here. And so Fuquay-Varina, dash more, became the final logo. The colors, I believe, were tweaked a little bit from where they were originally. But you'd think that this would be the end of it, and it's not, because in the next several pages, and we'll go through these pretty quickly, we start doing the brand standards manual. You guys familiar with brand standards manuals and graphic? Okay. Then I'll go go through it very quickly because there are, I don't know, like 15 different variations of this logo, because some say that have the tagline, some have the state of North Carolina, so it's Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina. Some have the mark here, some have it over on the left, some have it in the grayscale version, some are for like knockout, just a all white logo to be knocked out of the background. But just to kind of thumb through the next a few pages, we go through all of the details of, you know, the proper use of the logo, trying to maintain the integrity of how it appears and what the extended color palette is, what the appropriate fonts are to use with it, as well as some practical application from the water tower to the shirt to to some imagery and how that should work with it as well. So does that give you guys an idea of what the process is like in working with the multi-level client? There was also a big launch event when this logo was launched to the community that the mayor spoke at. They made me speak. I tried to keep it short because nobody wants to hear from me. I'm not the mayor. Actually, the mayor was pretty boring. He went into some stories about some really, really open. Anyway, go ahead. Yes. This process beginning to end was Between 3 and 4 months. And again, a lot of that is, strategy time up front. Creative development time is a big piece of the middle of that, and then at the back end, it's really just finalizing things and then organizing the launch event and getting all of that to happen. A video was produced that really got everybody all excited about, hey, our community's all these great things, and boom, here's our new logo. What was nice about it is they did it right in terms of getting everybody in the community feeling like, hey, this is actually really exciting. There's this big change that's happening here. It's not just, hey, here's our new logo. It was rallying around the idea of we are excited to be a community that has this blend of all these great things, and we're looking to improve things and grow and do all this stuff. And it became a good pep rally for the town, which was just capped off with the new logo that represented that. So anyway, I hope that is somewhat informative, hopefully, a little bit. All right, cool.
How many
What? Yeah.
revisions were made in the process?
Completely lost count. No idea. We actually put language in our contracts that cap it at 3 revisions, and anything beyond that needs to be estimated. We think that's important because they will drive you crazy if you don't do that. And that way their revisions are more considered, and it's not like finally somebody else chimed in and we want to get that and take a look at that change as well. It just forces them to be consolidated and thoughtful in what kind of revision information is there. Sometimes they'll go over that, but it's a really good way of keeping it in scope and under control.
It was really interesting to me to see the woven things that you had done.
Yeah.
Because when you said initially, this is the tobacco town,
Mhm.
that made me think of those tobacco baskets. That
Right.
So, I mean, did you look at, I'm sure you toured the town several times.
We did, yeah.
Just to get a good.
Does a trip to Aviator count as a tour? Let's just say it does. Okay. Yeah.
Both sides of the track.
Right, exactly.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any goals past clean design?
Retirement?
Are you gonna stay there forever, or like you're like have some aspirations of your own agency, or like?
Well, I'm one of 3 partners in the agency right now, so goal achieved. Yeah, and I'm already getting up there. So I turned 50 this year, so I'm not gonna. I'm trying to figure out when retirement happens, when that's possible. So yeah, I'm actually thrilled to be at a place where it's not a power trip at all, but it's more about finding a group of partners that we all want to build the same kind of place, where who we do business with is as important, if not more important, than the work we're doing. Because let's face it, it's just advertising and design, right? Which is very important to us and to our clients, but working with people on the client side as well as at the agency that you really like and respect, and that's where we spend the majority of our day. So let's make that great.
It can be really important, your pro bono work, to bring awareness to issues that, people need.
Absolutely, yeah. And we do everybody's got their corporate values and all of that kind of stuff, and so we have a few of those as well. And I can share a few of those with you. One is our kind of our corporate philosophy or whatever, is that we say we are in business to do good work for good people who make a good product and allow us to make good money. The only one that we will bend on is the good money, and that's because we do actually a lot of nonprofit work. In fact, at any given time, we've got about 10 or 11 nonprofits that are on the client roster. So we're doing a lot of that kind of stuff. We do that with Girl Scouts. We do that with Arts NC. We do that with Carolina Performing Arts. We do that with, oh gosh, I'll blank out on all of them. We actually started doing work with Carolina Ballet that way, but that has since turned into a paying client. And a number of others, and they're, actually American Heart Association, and the V Foundation, which I think I had the logo up here for that. So a ton of these, and always do that. Always want to give back to the community, not only through our work, but through time. I do a lot of board service. Natalie Perkins, our majority shareholder, does more board service than I can imagine any one person can do, especially with a full-time job on top of that. So, and then a lot of other people at the agency do that stuff as well. So being out and about and involved in the community and giving of our time and talents is important to us.
Kind of have a question.
Kinda gonna
doing
answer.
The card game thing with
Yeah.
the client. How do you handle it if you know that they are full of crap? If you got someone who's going, yeah, we're edgy, we're Mavericks, and you're going, you're a Food Lion. You're not edgy, you're not
Yeah.
Mavericks.
Well, we call them on it, you know, and that's part of the counsel we should be providing. In fact, we had a bank client that was absolutely convinced that, no, we are Mavericks. We do business like nobody else does. We are edgy, we are, you know, modern, we're energetic, and all of these things. And so to test that, we went through the design board exercise. And we're like, all right, you said you're a maverick, you said you're edgy. Are you edgy, or are you banker edgy? We discovered that there is, in fact, the term banker edgy has come up in so many meetings since then, because because you kind of get it. You're like, oh, okay, banker edgy.
You want your banker to be a maverick.
That's what I was saying.
Right, exactly.
You want to present yourself as a-
Exactly, and the thing is, the exercises help us to put proper definition to that and help us to keep that stuff in line, because they say, oh, no, we're doing things like nobody else does. Well, if you're looking from the inside, but if you're looking from the outside, that may not be the right message. So the process kind of builds on itself and helps to weed out anything that might get crazy. Yeah.
What qualities and experience do you typically look for in interns?
Availability. And I put that because we just started turning our intern program into a paid internship, and it's paid if we can get 20 hours or more a week from somebody. And that is not trying to squeeze time out of somebody. That is trying to make the most for both parties out of the experience. So the more that an intern is there, the more people are used to them being there and can give them more responsibility. They're able to do more contribution, and eventually stuff that they can either put in a portfolio. I've had interns that have ended up with produced client work. I have an intern that ended up illustrating a piece that, it was something that we did for Carolina Ballet that ended up in a national awards publication. She was working with another designer, but she was credited as the illustrator because she did that, and ended up in Print Regional Design Annual, which was pretty cool. And so we were really excited about not only being in there, but being able to give an intern credit where they had contributed. Okay, so it's not just availability. Certainly, we look at any kind of body of work that you've been able to assemble up to this point. To me, it doesn't matter so much that it's 20 pieces or whatever the magic number is. If you've got 2 pieces that you say, this represents how I think, or this represents my design ability, or this represents the kind of work I'd like to be doing, that's great. That's great. I don't need to see the pencil illustrations of pine cones, because I'm telling you, like art assignment, or like art class assignments and things like that, sometimes the assignments are just so far removed from a commercial application or from a branding application that I would rather not see it. A lot of books come in with, here's my photography work, which is basically their Instagram account. and here's my design work, and here's my writing work, and here's some PR that I did because my brother has a band, and whatever. I mean, I also like somebody who has a bit of focus, or at least says, I think I'm interested in this. I want to dive in and find out if this is really for me, which is great. So the interest, the talent, the availability, and somebody who has done a little bit of studying on the agency to say, hey, I really like what you guys did for XYZ, or tell me how you got to that work. I want to learn. So that willingness to learn, and somebody who has really done their homework and can ask some very directed questions, that's very impressive. I hope that answers.
Do you usually have set time for internships, like 3 months, 6 months, a year, or?
We're so flexible with that. I mean, a lot of times the school schedule will drive a lot of that. I have had several interns, in fact I have one right now, who has already graduated, but wants to do an internship to gain experience, continue to add to a portfolio, just to get really more acquainted themselves to the work environment and to start making connections and all of that. So sometimes those internships go on for like 6 months. And then in some instances, we've had interns who become employees. I had a design intern a couple years ago who has now joined our agency as an account manager or account coordinator. So she went from the creative side, discovered that was not really what she felt her most strength or strongest area was, and has joined as an account coordinator, which is fantastic. I think we've got 3 on staff right now who used to be interns. And we have 2 more, one strategist and one copywriter who interned with us last summer and are actually interning part-time right now, but both have intent to hire contracts with us, and will be joining us when they graduate in the spring, in the spring, summer. So, yeah, that whole intern thing, it's really useful. I wish I had interned when I was in school, but I didn't. I don't know why. Imagine what could have been. It could have been something. How did I start off? I was an advertising major at the University of Georgia, minor in graphic design, and I very quickly realized after graduation that was not going to get me a job. I was probably the only one that I graduated with. There were probably 30 or 40 of us that graduated at the same time with an advertising major. I was the only one who wanted to go into the creative side of this business. I thought, that's kind of crazy. Why do you want to go into media or something? I don't know. I didn't get it. I'm like, but so I discovered that I needed a portfolio. The portfolio was what was going to get me a job. The education or the resume was kind of secondary. In fact, it was almost something that they would glance at after a creative director or somebody who was in a hiring position for a creative person. They were going to look at my book first and make a decision whether I was the kind of creative person that they would hire. So I ended up going to a school called Portfolio Center in Atlanta. And now it was, at the time it was about the only school of its kind, but now there is Miami Ad Center, there's Creative Circus, there's VCU Brand Center, and then a few others scattered throughout the country. But those are schools that are designed to get you, to help you build a portfolio that's going to get you a job. Very, very focused on assigning work that is about portfolio building. So in doing that, working through classes here, doing work outside of that, just, taking ads that you see in the world or design work that you see in the world that you feel like it could be better. I mean, I've had suggested a number of times, it's like, you know what, I looked at this, I thought I could do a better job, so here's my version of that. So that's great thinking. That's a real good glimpse into how you think. So, your portfolio is even me at this point, the work that I have to show for what I can do that's how our careers rise and fall.
Can you repeat that part, that when someone sees something, they think they can do a better job?
Yeah.
What are you referring to exactly again?
It could be a logo, it could be an ad, it could be it could be an album cover. I don't know. It could be anything in the world, depending on what it is that you want to prove, what ability that you want to prove. Just find something that you feel like could be better and say, I decided to do my version of this. I could see that the strategy was to communicate blah, 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 so here's how I think that could be done better. So it's just one thing that you could do as a portfolio building exercise. There's no right or wrong way to do that. I'm just saying that was something that I've heard suggested a number of times, and I thought it was...
I just wasn't sure if there'd be any legalities, like...
what you're doing, if you're putting a student portfolio together, you're, and again, I am not a lawyer, so I do not speak from the law, but through, I guess, experience, that a student book that is done as spec work, no, there's not a problem with that. The only thing that gets trickier is now everybody's portfolio is online. And so if the smart thing you can do just to avoid any problems like that is attribution, is to just say, hey, this came from this website. Here is my basically unpublished work to show how I think and how what my design thinking is like. Is that fair?
So most portfolios now are individually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you see any with any kind of handwork in it?
No, not a one. Seriously, it's kind of crazy. When I got into this business, portfolios were FedExed around, and they were giant, clunky boxes and cases, and now they are links to a site.
How many portfolio pieces would you say we should have maximum in a finished portfolio?
I would look at it the opposite way and just say which ones. Yeah, I would say.
In general, what is too much?
Yeah, I could give a number. I mean, but I would say that if including like campaigns and things like that, if you had 20 pieces that are all equally fantastic and represent the very best of your work, go for it. I think going over that is kind of overkill, but there are a lot of different things to prove these days, from web design to collateral print to advertising to broadcast, even if you have storyboards for an idea for a commercial, or and identity work, and I mean, there are just so many e-publication. The list goes on and on and on. So there are a lot of things that you might want to be able to prove out through additional pieces, but I would stop short of showing anything that does not represent the best of your talent. And if that means 3 pieces, let it be 3 pieces.
I mean, you probably don't find many people that are creative every,
Yeah. I'm not.
even if they think they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I'm confused. David, you said the hand, were you talking about like hard copy portfolios and?
Like handcrafted.
Like Jim, he's like crafting his like whole.
I got you, like wood or leather or something.
Mm.
Like, okay.
Yeah.
I just wasn't
Inking it
sure.
out or making actually producing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that years ago.
That's great. It's not going to hurt him. I'll tell you that. It's not going to hurt him. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you suggest, like, what's your opinion on having a ridiculously versatile, like, some of our teachers tell us that we should have like a specified, like, idea, like, no, we should be more like specific in the sense that we should have more illustration if we want to be an illustrator. Or, and then we have other teachers that are like, oh, well, you need to and your photography, and your illustrations, and your campaign work, and your, like all of it?
Not to say one is right as one is wrong. My own opinion is that you should be focused on the kind of work, showing the kind of work that you want to be doing.
And one more question in regards to that. When you create your portfolio, when you make it actual, you know, the layout and everything, when you take one piece, for example, an illustration that you have done, would you suggest that we put it in some kind of mock-ups or like different products to showcase, or just leave it by itself on the page?
I think it's actually fine to show the multiple applications of an illustration. If you did the designs for those different pieces, I think that that's fine to show as a campaign. The other thing that I would mention, though, is you want to present your work with respect, meaning ganging a bunch of stuff up on a page and making it crowded and making it hard to appreciate this thing of beauty, you know, is you're doing yourself a disservice that way. I would rather see more pages where there is one beautiful piece of work isolated, instead of trying to say, hey, well, all these pieces of the campaign, there were like 18 different things, and look at all the stuff I did. I would rather see those things individually and see the thought and the craft and the care and the ideas that went into each of them. And if if there were all those pieces and you just say, well, then it would be so many pages, then take some of them out. Just show the best.
Yeah, I have one more question.
Can I ask a question to you guys? What's the traffic like getting back toward Raleigh this time of day?
It's not too bad.
Okay.